So Veronica and Erez, they are both designers. They are teaching and researching in the design field. Their work is dealing with politics in a very different way. More literally, we can say, in a Tal case, and touching the issues linked to biodesign, can we say so, for Veronica. So the more natural question for them is the school a political tool?
That's the question. I think it's almost a rhetorical question. I would say that in the most maybe abstract way, the school tries to inflict form on unshaped minds. So this battle between structure and anarchy is basically a political action, and I think it happens between mentor and student, but also between mentor and the system, between old knowledge and new knowledge. And I think maybe at its best, the school is a moderated and well-argumented arena for small rebellions, so that pushes the profession forward, but also the system. More specifically, I think design is a political field, so everything about design is political. I mean, even by sheer numbers, mass-produced object has a potentially mass effect on the consumers. And maybe more to the point, design or the designer's job is quite a risky job in a consumer economic system and consumer political system. It needs to appeal to the irrational desires of his consumers, and that may be kind of a risky territory to play in. But I think what's most important is that I heard this question several times during these talks: is do we still need schools, etc.? And I think it usually has been touched upon from the individual perspective, maybe, of the student. But I think at its best, the school can not only formulate agendas, social-political agendas, but it also has immediate disciples for these agendas that carry it forward. And that, I think, is a very important political role. And you can see, at least ideally, these ideas coming ever since this social modernist agenda of the Bauhaus, but also here in the Design Academy and their shift towards a humanist agenda by putting the man in the center. So I think at its best it can really try to push forward the political debate in society by using his disciples to carry it forward.
Veronica?
So, in regards to the question, I can almost only agree to what Tal said. I mean, it's almost a rhetorical question to say, okay, is school political? For sure it is political. I mean, it's almost by definition political because it is, in a way, more or less so strongly involved into funding structures in governmental action plans. It's almost impossible to see it standing by itself without all these influences from governmental side. So surely it is a political tool, but my question is also what is a school by definition? This may be more the question, how do you define the school? Is it not just a platform for debate, and where can it also take place? I mean, is a school always only a building, or is it also happening in other places? Is it also maybe happening in digital spaces, for example? Is it literally only a house with people inside, you know? I mean, I personally think you can take this political discourse and what is a school also outside of an institution, and basically think about it more as a kind of mindset of battle and education. But that also shouldn't be just defined more or less or restricted to, I think, a certain age frame. I think it's more or less something that we once had in the past with humanistic ideals as a lifelong learning process rather, and a kind of accessibility and affordability to, like, yeah, allowing for mistakes, I think, as well, like, and failure. And this is something that I kind of see, I don't know, almost like a little bit vanishing. Yeah, I should say,
So
yeah.
I think that both of you started saying that this is a rhetorical question. So how is it to teach the awareness that design is a political tool? How it is it to...
Well, I mean, I'm personally approaching it like, I'm approaching it more or less like with using design as a tool in order to like think about critical aspects in our society that you cannot really put in words and that you cannot really like bring on the table with other means. So let's say I'm using a more or less established aesthetics or established and implemented way of objects, for example, like or in general like mediums that we know and surround us already, and then like implementing my idea in them in a, I would say, almost strategic way that that kind of reveal you have the idea more or less implemented into the object, but you kind of approach it and you get intrigued by its aesthetics, and it kind of comes across in the very first, I would say, impression as a kind of almost yeah, generic or well-known aesthetic, and then you start thinking about it because you're already intrigued by such an object, and then realizing, okay, there is a subversive potential in it, but by like allowing people to join such thinking by engaging them with, I would say, very well known aesthetics. I think this is something that can be surely seen as an ideology in itself, but as long, I would say, is you kind of highlight the fact that you would say these are critical projects or speculative projects. This is a kind of very, I would say, successful way of like taking away these barriers and borders that people always perceive and feel when it comes to meaningful or political projects. You encounter that many ways. You go into museums, you go into galleries, and people feel like, oh, I'm not eligible, or not, I'm like to judge on the subject, or I'm not eligible to participate or build an opinion around this area. This has to do also like with a feeling of being allowed to participate. And once you kind of approach people in a very everyday life aesthetic, I think it becomes a very, very powerful tool to engage people in ideas and thoughts they thought they would have never been able to think about and verbalize and formulate an opinion on it.
Yeah, I think I agree that usually the tools to communicate ideas work best when they work from within a known system or using known mediums. I think the question is not only how can you teach that the school is a political tool, but who needs to learn this? I mean, I don't think it's important to the general public. I am not sure it's even, if the question is about the school as a political tool, then I'm not even sure it's important for designers. I think it's important for the people who stand in positions of power within the education system, the people who run or will run schools. And I think you do it probably from within the system as a teacher. You do it through this talk. You do it through magazines. You do it with all the mediums that present ideas, but also present ideas to your target audience. I think the question how do you convince people that design is political, that I think again, I'm not sure it's relevant to the general public, but I'm sure it's relevant for designers, and I think that's exactly what the school is for. And not only that design is political in general, but what kind of politics you want your design to broadcast. So again, I take the example of the Design Academy that at least ideally try to say, man in the center, we are a humanitarian school, we think about the end user, and that's a political agenda. That was understood by the people who made this change, and that was broadcasted by the choice of mentors and curriculum, and eventually trickled down to the students who hopefully push this agenda forward.
So going back to the risks you were referring briefly before, Angela before was mentioning the Kickstarter and this way in which everybody is able now to bring a project very easily to be realized. So these make even more important maybe the idea of a political design.
Yeah, I think, first I don't think it's that easy. I think also on Kickstarter you need to have some qualities to get people to pay for it.
Yes.
But I agree. I think the more and more systems or old systems of the production chain are being distributed and digitized and kind of dissimulated, which leaves, I think, the designer with less and less places to hide. So he can't hide behind the big money, he can't hide behind big business, and he has to really he's held more and more responsible to the outcomes. People that issue a project on Kickstarter are designers, I mean, generally, or in a broad spectrum, and I think they are now also the designers, but they're also the entrepreneurs and the manufacturers and the marketing people. So I think I don't think it was ever not a political tool, but or not a political profession, but I think we have less chances to run away from our responsibility here. And I think we have to be aware of it. And I think we also have to be aware of the fact that what we do, even if it's kind of hidden by lifestyle or aesthetics, I think lifestyle and aesthetics, lifestyle for sure, are political tools. So I think we have to be aware of this, and we have to understand that we have responsibilities towards our users, towards our consumers, and towards our environment, of course.
Our work addresses the topic of consumer in a really wider way than your work.
Yeah.
And maybe through some example regarding your research, you can tell us more about the idea of design as political tool, referring more directly to your research.
So my very recent work was actually looking very much into the field of like tissue engineering, for example. I've looked into various scientific fields because I also became fascinated by this like current tendency of scientism that you can almost see everywhere, like also like seeping and transmitting into the design schools at the moment quite a lot. And that is also like more or less intertwined with funding structures in schools, which is also quite interesting because it is almost like, in a way, encouraged to kind of prove your work in a scientific way, which is interesting in itself because, like, I mean, science in a way, it's not necessarily the best tool to accumulate knowledge, and I mean, I think this is in a way, actually the purpose of a school in a way, like encouraging the accumulation of knowledge, expanding and exchange of knowledge. So therefore I felt like, okay, I would like to study fields in biotech that are already quite a bit established and they're quite well trodden as well, like for example tissue engineering. And thought, okay, this is a really interesting field with great potential, but on the other hand, there are already like paths trodden in a relatively new field, and the public is not even aware of it yet. And so I was thinking, how can a designer actually intervene and maybe like show an alternative to something that is not even necessarily closely related to design. So what I suggested is a more or less like craftsmanship approach towards tissue engineering. So, okay, this is a very hot topic at the moment, but I was thinking, what kind of implications does this craftsmanship also have in detail, not just, okay, we can do this by hand, but also like what does it mean, and what kind of like human interaction does it potentially hold, and how is this actually also interesting in terms of sustainability.
Before you were talking about the funding, for example.
Yeah, well, the funding, for example, how is that intertwined? As I said, design projects also are kind of encouraged to back up their work with scientific reasoning and scientific theories. Whereas I'm not always quite sure if this should be the focus of attention. I mean, this is for sure a really interesting approach, but on the other hand, a lot of, I would say, work that cannot be measured in scientific terms and scientific terminology would be like equally also like excluded out of this consideration for funding. So I mean, you can see that also, like, for example, in the UK, that lots of funding goes these days towards like the so-called STEM like subject, and like arts and humanities are like more and more or less like shoved to the like outskirts, and like being cut out of funding structures. So this is really interesting. So I kind of see almost there's a desperation in a way, like from designers towards this like bio art, and like, okay, we're gonna go and join the forces in like with scientifically inspired work. So yeah, some people might say like my work also like fits very much in this world of scientific hyping almost. But what I wanted to highlight as well is how the power of a design work, for example, could also encourage people to value and appreciate other ways of reassessing an already established technology or path, and how that can even perhaps give an impulse to the decision makers elsewhere. So I think a design is a tool to visually, or like with the senses, inform your decision making by explicitly making this like I would say transparent. Because I like, for example, the work I'm making is not real. It's like speculative. It's critical. It's not really like made for production. I think that can be like a very interesting platform where we can like bounce around ideas, but also more or less like in a very charming way criticize the kind of structures that made all of this possible. So I think it's a kind of, I would say, subtle, more or less a subtle way of like critique.
So, yes, a reaction.
Yeah, I think I think the very important point is that of funding, and I think it's really one important link between the school system and the government that again is tricky because it really can influence the school in a political way, or like Veronica said, maybe push designers into where the money is. And I think that's also, even if it's research or speculative, and I think that's also very interesting. I think I'm a little bit concerned. It's kind of intuitive, and I come from Israel, so maybe I see it more there, with this kind of growing pedagogical approach to the design schools. Really, in a time where everything is kind of being decentralized and standardized, really trying to standardize the school system, which I think limits quite a lot of possibilities of pushing new agendas forward. But I guess what we learn more and more through these times in general, and I think in all fields, is that we have to figure out the ways to work within the system. And that's why I think also design is quite important, because design is a very strong link in the system, but being educated in a, let's say, cultural kind of, I wouldn't say radical, but trying to think outside of the system. So I think it's an important link to where change can be made, which has really a serious effect on the way, on where we live, how we live.
Okay, thank you guys.